Hello, everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining me to this presentation, wherever you are. Today, I'll try to address how the rise of negative emotions in politics, or what scholars have called affective polarization, is a product not just of recent socioeconomic, political, or demographic changes, or of the creation of a new media landscape. Rather, I think it has been the outcome of decades or maybe even centuries of socioeconomic, technological, and cultural developments, which have accelerated, of course, with the revolution in information technology. To better understand why negative emotions have become so central to political life, I believe we need to take into account a larger psychocultural shift over the last 60 to 70 years, and to understand also its underlying neurobiological mechanisms, what you see here at the bottom of the screen. To do this, I'll draw on some classical social theory and also on recent research in neurobiology. Uh, Affective polarization refers to the way that political divisions are now increasingly characterized not just by policy disagreements, but primarily by strong negative emotions toward political opponents. For example, anger, fear, disgust, contempt, and the like. Political psychologists have developed various methods to measure these emotions, and while they can measure them with some accuracy, we still don't fully understand why they have intensified so much in recent years. It's not just that people disagree more, it's that they dislike, distrust, and even dehumanize those on the other side. This shift has some real consequences. It can affect voting behavior, willingness to compromise, even personal relationships. But I'll not address these issues here. For me, the big question, as I noted, is why have negative emotions intensified so much in recent years? And why have they acquired so much political salience? That is what I'll try to explore here, focusing primarily on the United States. Of course, affective polarization has also become a global phenomenon, but somehow it has intensified most dramatically in the United States, and most of the research is done there. In addition to affective polarization, scholars have suggested also some other concepts to capture related developments. Negative partisanship conveys mostly the idea that polarization now is driven not so much by love for our party and its supporters, but it's mostly driven by outgroup hate, hate for the other side. Then there's pernicious polarization, which points essentially to identity-based antagonism, and some similar concepts are political sectarianism and also ethnic antagonism. And they also seem to point to prospects of the creation of deeply divided societies, essentially. A very troubling prospect, if anything. I think the explanations that have been given for this surge in negative emotions, some of them are quite familiar. They're really not very adequate. And I think there's a missing link, which is mostly related to, as I noted, processes of longer-term psychocultural change, and particularly the erosion of self-regulation. I have to say I use psychocultural here mostly in its vocabulary sense to mean interaction between psychological and cultural factors at the individual and also the societal level. And I also think there's a need to examine the underlying neurobiological mechanism for all these psychocultural changes, and particularly the erosion of self-regulation. These are related mostly to chronic stress, but also maybe excitement, generally overstimulation, chronic arousal that can really create disinhibition. And as I noted, the information technology revolution has largely greatly amplified all these trends, and I'll try to explain how. To understand all these psychocultural changes, I think we need to go back to the 1960s. And it strikes me that when examining political polarization, the youth rebellion and counterculture of the 1960s is very rarely mentioned. There's usually a focus on the civil rights movement, school desegregation, the flight of Southern Democrats and their supporters from the Democratic Party. And these developments are important, but I also think we need to revisit this kind of countercultural revolution that happened back then. At the time, it seemed very sudden and abrupt, but some perceptive thinkers had anticipated maybe similar, if not exactly the same developments. For example, Emil Durkheim, the French sociologist, argued that growing affluence, and this was, by the way, at the end of the 19th century, growing affluence, the freeing of the economy from any traditional religious constraints, and the overall excitation of human desires, including greed, by the way, were creating essentially a normative vacuum or a condition of what he called anomie. Later, sociologist Daniel Bell built on some of those insights and described how capitalism, consumer culture, easy credit, and also technological developments contributed to further weakening of self-control and of delayed gratification, a set of problems that he labeled the cultural contradictions of capitalism. Some other scholars have also tried to examine some of those shifts with a more or less critical attitude. It's obvious that progressive scholars have given a more positive spin to all those developments. And of course, we all now know whom conservatives and libertarians like to blame. Of course, it's not capitalism. I have also included here a couple of French and German thinkers who have been translated into English and who have generally described long-term process of creeping organized disinhibition that they associate with Western modernization. In their view, it has led to excessive risk-taking, colonial conquest, capitalist economic expansion, consumerism, social disruptive technological innovation, and similar developments. As you can see, different scholars have given different assessments to all these developments, but it looks like it's a real trend and it has been recognized as fairly significant. The next step, I think, would be to try to examine the neurobiological underpinnings of all these changes. And I think a good starting point could be a concept that was suggested again back in the 60s by neurobiologist Paul Sterling and epidemiologist Joseph Ayer. This concept is allostasis. It literally means stability through change, and they suggested it as an alternative for the more static concept of homeostasis, which is more familiar. In their view, the brain generally regulates predictively physiological processes through the whole organism to ensure that it can respond effectively to prospective challenges and opportunities that is well prepared. Such finely tuned regulation helps the organism prepare for expected threat and opportunities. And while large fluctuations from baseline or normal levels of chemical messengers, arousal, blood circulation, metabolism may be quite helpful in this respect, if demands from the environment remain high, there's a chance that the neurobiological baselines will be shifted far outside evolutionary ranges. And such long-term maladaptation can really constitute allostatic load and can, over the long term, lead to arousal pathologies. And one of the most important among those they thought was dysregulation of dopaminergic reward. And reward here is in inverted commas for a reason, because I think it's a somewhat misleading term, but I'll leave this aside. Another scholar who focused on a similar kind of dysregulation is Canadian psychologist Bruce Alexander, who famously created the rat pack experiment. He believed that capitalism really induced a degree of dislocation in society and for individuals, which resulted in frustrated basic human needs and a compulsive lifestyle that he associated with various chemical and behavioral addictions. By the way, the drive to accumulate money and power, he thought he was part of that. My favorite in this list is British American neuropsychiatrist Peter Wybrow, who wrote a book by the name of American Mania. He believed this was a syndrome that had some genetic basis, and American society is a society of immigrants who are mostly risk takers. He thought they were particularly predisposed to experience it. But he also emphasized a broader problem that was related to what in evolutionary psychology is referred to as evolutionary mismatch. He thought that we as a species have developed a long time ago in the African savanna, where there was mostly scarcity. We lived in small communities. There would be just sporadic stress or excitement, and then going back to baseline. So he thought, as we have developed under these conditions for most of our evolutionary history, we are not really well adjusted to abundance. And this would include abundance of information, which unfortunately he did not consider in great detail. Psychologist John Gardner offered a somewhat similar analysis, describing an American hypomanic edge, which he also thought had some genetic basis. And he thought it, in fact, was mostly positive. He believed it was at the heart of the kind of economic dynamism and prosperity that American society had achieved. On the other hand, he recognized that it also had a dark side and had fueled hubris, aggressive self-assertion, and messianic zeal. Fred Previch is another psychologist who developed a somewhat similar idea of what he called the dopaminergic mind. He cast a longer look back to our evolutionary history and was not so much focused on recent developments. But his analysis allows us to think of maybe some limits to adaptation. There's a tendency really to emphasize plasticity, the plasticity of the human brain and organism, but any adaptation, it must have some limits. And so then the question is, are we running up to some of those limits? The next name here is Scottish sociologist John Bone, and he has borrowed a military acronym, which refers to a combination of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In society, this combination, Bone believes, has created really a very overwhelming social environment for most of us, particularly given in mind the kind of neurobiological limitations that he also associates with human evolution. And he thinks the effect of this overwhelm is what he calls primalization, essentially a set of trends towards seemingly emotionally driven, angry, fearful, fatalistic, broadly irrational responses to conduct in social life. And he thinks this is really evidenced in a very wide range of social ills, from angry interpersonal conflict, both online and offline, personal angst across a wide range of issues, but also things like substance abuse or engagement with bizarre ideas and conspiracy theories, and the embrace of radically problematic political agendas. Underlying all these problems is, again, dopaminergic dysregulation, the problem to which Sterling and Aya pointed so many decades ago. And since emotional and behavioral dysregulation, they seem to be more self-explanatory, I want to focus here on cognitive dysregulation, disinhibition. This is essentially a reduced ability to suppress dysfunctional thoughts, and it can really lead to ideological obsession, or what psychologists have also called attachment to extreme overvalued beliefs. And these are really ideological in nature, but in fact, the phenomenon can be seen as akin to other phenomena, which in some cases can seem healthy and non-ideological, like, for example, um, uh, um, compulsions or obsessions related to ultra-healthy eating, extreme physiological exertion, but also the kind of paranoia and ruminations that we associate with mass shooters or the incel movement or targeted individuals, tens of thousands of people in different countries who believe they're all the time being monitored by the government and secret services. So this means that cognitive disinhibition can also make it easier to embrace all sorts of outlandish conspiracy theories or paranoid beliefs. In this context, I think ideological extremism can be understood as being marked not only by a peculiar substantive focus, but also by the obsessiveness and the intensity with which beliefs are held and expressed, and also the disproportionate response to even slight provocations. Self-control is usually associated with self-discipline and consciously applied willpower or executive function, but some research has suggested that social emotions and empathy are also key to it, which means that their weakening can undermine further self-regulation and also can lead to dehumanization of opponents. And once this happens, anything goes. All these trends have been greatly amplified by the digital age. And again, some of the ways in which this happen are more familiar and they have been studied. I think there's also a more general effect of our exposure to screens, more general effects that one of the early Cassandras, Susan Greensfeld, attempted to capture by this concept of mind change that he suggested by analogy with climate change. Of course, political leaders and influencers can also contribute, helping normalize disdain towards political opponents, and the end result can be reinforced feedback loops leading to further polarization. I also wanted to emphasize here that though some of those developments, they can seem very recent and problems can seem really new, there is a group of influential thinkers who, in the past, examined problems related to the proliferation of images, leading to what they thought was a blurred distinction between reality and fabrication, and really a condition of unreality, or however you want to call it. And I wanted to emphasize in particular Marshall McLuhan's contribution here. He is known with this cryptic pronouncement, but generally he believed that it was not so much the content of what we consume with media, but it was really the nature of the medium itself and our exposure to it that was creating some effects on human minds and brains. And essentially, he thought that the youth rebellion happened in the 1960s because this was the first generation that had grown up with television. And he also predicted that the proliferation of images would lead essentially to the reemergence of oral culture and a new kind of new tribalism. In conclusion, I just want to say that again, we should understand the escalation of negative emotions in politics not just as a result of recent events or bad actors, but as the result of longer-term psychocultural shifts in a context where our limited neurobiological and mental capacities are overwhelmed in an overly demanding social environment. I believe problems are mostly structural, which means they're not really amenable to easy solutions, though, of course, we should not be fatalistic. And I also fear political science and psychology right now are ill-equipped to address some of those larger issues and to understand human motivation. They have become dominated by an extreme version of the weird tunnel vision described in an influential psychology article, and I also think by an empiricist, method-driven, highly analytic misconstrual of social knowledge that I try to address in a longer article. So I believe there is a need for broader, more holistic approach to all those issues, though I have to say I'm not holding my breath. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.